Radical Russ sent you.
It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and a leading author and researcher on cannabinoids and health, who pins the Ask Dr. Mitch column for High Times magazine. Get your questions ready in our live chat or call in to 971-533-7111 now.
All right, welcome back, everyone. 29 and a half after the hour, and we've got Dr. Mitch on the phone. How you doing, Mitch?
Great day, great day.
You know, I have to disagree. I'm not very fond of upstate New York right now after the NFL game.
I can certainly understand.
I'm not happy at all, dang it. Oh, well. At least I'm upset about something that really doesn't mean anything, so there we go. Oh, so we're headed out to the end of the year here and taking questions from our chat room here on 420radio.org. Or you can dial us live at 971-533-7111. And before we take our questions, we always open up with Dr. Mitch telling us the first word and what's the latest in cannabis science.
As I think you mentioned, there's FDA approval for a study at University of Alabama in Birmingham looking at basically a cannabidiol-based oil on both pain and some seizure stuff. And then there was I thought, kind of disappointing article in the Journal of American Medical Association trying to basically blame a whole lot of things in Colorado on new cannabis laws that, in fact, seem to ignore some of the problems related to prohibition.
You know, I'm interested in these studies now and whether or not FDA is going to prove these things because, number one, we're talking about CBD oil where there's no chance of intoxication, but more to the point with the recent news with this Cromnibus Bill passing and saying they're not going to mess with the states that have medical marijuana laws. How do you think that's going to bode for the FDA and NIDA approving these studies in the future?
It's funny because I feel like if that's really the case, if you're not in a university where federal funding might be threatened under those circumstances, then I feel like those guys are going to sidestep NIDA and essentially, use cannabis or at least, rely on state sources in a way that's really going to have the chance to make big advances as far as some of this stuff is concerned. I know a lot of universities are pretty apprehensive about this. Nobody wants to seem to be the first one. But if somebody will, sort of take the lead with it, I think we're going to see a lot of really great, interesting new data.
So is this, that's something that's realistic now, is using state-sourced marijuana rather than relying on Dr. El Soli's University of Mississippi swag?
Well, so Igor Grant down at UC San Diego pulled this off when they had some money coming in from when California's laws first changed. And got away with it, and those data are published and actually pretty interesting. And then I feel like that might set a precedent. I could certainly imagine folks in Colorado going ahead and braving it, or maybe setting up some little off-campus location that could end up being a research area that got IRB approval, and suddenly we'll get more data on these different strains and individual effects that might be strain dependent. It's wide open and seems like it could go okay. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and this provision in the Cromnibus Bill is on funding for the Department of Justice. So that doesn't really touch NIDA or FDA, does it?
Well, but in fact, NIDA's only reason to be involved in this is because they were the only legal source of cannabis for this kind of research before. But I feel like, again, if investigators can get cannabis essentially legally because of state laws, they ought to be capable of gathering some of the data we really need on this.
All right. Well, let's go to our chat room because we got a question here. A fellow Idahoan asking whether or not what you could tell us about cannabis and traumatic brain injury.
Well, so we've got some pretty compelling evidence, at least in the animal literature, that cannabinoids can protect neurons from trauma-related damage. And so if you can basically get cannabinoids in the system as soon after a trauma as possible, odds are high it's going to turn out a lot better than if you didn't.
That's great news, and we are looking forward to the day when that makes its way to sports. Combat sports and NHL and NFL. These guys, suffer a great deal of traumatic brain injury, and we see the toll that it takes on them, even in their late 40s, early 50s. So we really need to get this moving forward, and hopefully now that we're getting some leeway from the federal government with respect to the medical states, maybe some of these athletic commissions can come around on this now, since it doesn't look like the feds are going to give them any problem. Have you heard any word with respect to that angle, the sports science angle of this?
I know Lester Grinspoon wrote a really heartfelt tale, and he's quite the football fan, so he wanted to make a big deal about how he wants to enjoy the sport and not feel guilty about people taking a good hit. A pounding.
Right.
And the idea that there might be a vaporizer on the sidelines and you wouldn't go back in after you had some cannabis, but that would be available in order to minimize the impact would just be good common sense.
Yeah, would love to see that happen. All right, let's go to that piece that we saw trying to blame a lot of health problems on Colorado legalization. It seems like both sides are eager to say what legalization has meant in Colorado, both good and bad. What did you take away from this article that was kind of didn't really sit well with you?
My disappointment is both about this cyclic vomiting syndrome, which, again, we don't have a ton of published data, maybe 12 individual cases. It's not clear what these folks were using. We really don't have a lot of folks who are using, above ground registered good cannabis like we have in Colorado and Washington. And then they're claiming, I get this cyclic vomiting syndrome. We've got, enough cases to think something's going on, certainly, but I have no idea whether it's really cannabis or some kind of contaminant that might have been in these. And nobody seems to pay attention to the idea that maybe this is a product of prohibition in an underground market. And then anytime anybody blames cannabis for these flash fires associated with, poorly made oil, it really makes my blood boil, because this is not a product of cannabis. This is a byproduct of prohibition and really, an industrial accident that's in part often the result of trying to be surreptitious or clandestine in the way that you're making these oils.
Yeah. Every now and then a moonshine still in the woods would explode in Kentucky too, back in the day.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Oh my goodness. And yeah, I'm seeing that as well. People that are trying to talk about this hyperemesis syndrome. I got an email from a listener who wanted to correct me when I mentioned, this possible cyclical vomiting syndrome, because it's a different thing. He said he actually has the cyclical vomiting syndrome, the original syndrome, absent any, cannabis use. He'd already had that diagnosis, and he found that cannabis actually helped him with the CVC, and said that it was a different thing than what people are talking about when they say over dab or something like that. Is there a great difference, or is just not a lot known yet?
The clincher on this seems to be its persistence. So people claim that they're, literally vomiting all day long, and the only way they can get relief is with these hot showers, and it doesn't last very long. And, yes, there are a lot of, CB2 receptors along the GI tract, but I honestly, I'm super suspicious that this is some kind of oddball contaminant, some strange fertilizer issue, or something about some mutant strain that really never got discovered, in part because the base rate of this phenomenon is just so low.
Okay. We've got some folks in the chat room that wanted to wish you and your family a happy Hanukkah, considering the season starts tomorrow, I believe. And that leads to the question, is cannabis kosher?
What's funny is this seems to come out every year around Passover, because certain seeds and certain grains end up being forbidden during Passover. And as you guys know, my father-in-law is a rabbi, and I actually ended up contacting somebody at the University of Judaism about this, and he says, by all means, your hemp seeds are completely kosher, and like a lot of grains, just make sure you don't overeat them.
There we go. Got another question here. A person asking about any tips for purchasing cannabis topicals, trying to find some for arthritis and having limited results.
I got to admit the transdermal work is very hard to predict, and some of the patches now actually have other things built in to kind of create light scratches along the skin so that there's a better chance for absorption. I don't have any published data on this, unfortunately, and I know some folks really swear by, say, coconut oil or some other oils. The only times I've ever used them, I've also been getting a massage at the same time, so I honestly don't know if it was the massage or the cannabis oil. And I think it's unfortunately a situation where we just have to try and hope for the best, or else turn to these patches that seem to have a patented way to transmit cannabinoids transdermally.
All right. Well, returning back to the subject of cannabis and religion, we get a question from the chat room about the early Jewish and Christian people and their use of cannabis and whether or not it was truly an anointing oil as used by the rabbis back then.
Well, so there's a lot of debate on this, and in part the Hebrew and Aramaic words sound a little bit like cannabis. But when I, actually sit down with folks who are kind of immersed in that area of scholarship, they sort of chuckle and say odds are against it. If you think about where cannabis first started in Taiwan and how it might have made its way down to northern Africa, it's not inconceivable, and this may be one of those things that we just really never have an answer to.
All right. Well, yeah, a lot of people feel pretty strongly about that. I've heard references to it being actually calamus or some sort of fragrant cane. No real way of getting any sure answer on this, I wouldn't imagine.
It's funny because the historians are big on that calamus interpretation and actually find that a little more compelling and more likely, in part just because we don't see a ton of hemp or other related things in those same areas, which you might want to predict if the plant really were available.
Okay, one last question here with regard to psoriasis. Got a person who mentions using a cannabis-infused olive oil for treatment of psoriasis. Is that something you've heard about, or other general cannabis treatments for psoriasis?
I have in the skin conditions more generally, in eczema as well. And I think oil alone actually does have some impact, so we don't want to overinterpret the cannabinoid contribution. But it's one of those things, too, where there aren't a lot of negative consequences, so why not give it a try and see what happens? It's not like you're going to have some nasty side effect like you might with some other prescribed medications.
All right. Well, as we get more and more legal, we'll have more and more opportunity to get more and more data, and we can get some real answers to some of this stuff. But for now, we thank you for what we do know, Dr. Mitch, and thank our listeners for asking the questions. Thanks for being here.
And a hearty happy Hanukkah to everybody.
All right. We'll light one up for 8 days in a row. How's that? Thanks, Dr. Mitch. All right, stay tuned, folks. We got time for a radical rant here. We're going to talk about that, perceptions of legal marijuana, how society is being forced to change through legality. Stick around.
You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.